Now, let's launch the Q&A session. Martin and I will lead that, and we'll start that now. Thank you.
We've had plenty of questions coming in, and to get us started, Les, thank you. Good one. I don't know the answer to this one, so there's a good start. You've written to us saying, how are meteorites being factored into the equation? Good question. I mean, from my point of view, asteroids, I think we know more about asteroids than we certainly do about meteorites. So I'm thinking on the bigger scale of an asteroid, we probably keep more of a wary eye out for that. Funnily enough, a colleague of mine who's on this call actually has just said there's been a recent close encounter with another asteroid going past us. I shall have to read about that. I wonder how close it was. Anyway, so Les, I don't know the answer directly to that one, other than, to me, it's a very random event, although we do know when there's a likelihood of more activity rather than less. So there is some predictive models going on there about when things happen. So I'm guessing people do that. But rather than me wittering on here, Jonas, can you help me out here? Do you have a proper answer to this question about how do we handle meteorites? Over to you, Jonas.
Okay, yeah, maybe let me add something about the micrometeorites. To my knowledge, they are not really considered during actual operations, simply for the reason that the orbital data that's available on these objects is usually not good enough. I mean, they're coming from somewhere, they're getting into your satellite's orbit, and then they're gone again. So it's hard to factor them in. But I know for a fact that during mission design, for example, they are considered. So when you do a pre-mission analysis of space debris impact on your satellite, you consider the impact of micrometeoroids there as well, usually as a statistical value. And there you're not interested in how you can avoid them, but how can you design your mission that this meteoroid dust, so to say, does not impact it. So especially if you have very sensible optical surfaces, for example, you wouldn't point them in a preferred direction where you know that a lot of meteorites are coming from. And you would also take care that during meteoroid streams that appeared at certain times during the year, you wouldn't point in this direction.
Okay, so it's a very random thing. In other words, it's so random you can't, you can predict things. You know when meteor showers are around, you know when certain activities will happen, but overall you don't know where these objects are going to be at any 1 minute, because it is a truly random issue.
Yes. Yeah. Looking from the satellite itself, it's random, and when you look at it on the overall picture, there are two features. You have the random background meteoroid, so to say, and you have the non-random streams, but the single position of one meteoroid within those streams is
fair enough.
Not known.
I mean, okay, I see that. That was great. Thank you. Valentine, you did say something at the time. I'm going to just change this a minute. I mean, Valentine, have you got anything to add to the thing while we have a short conversation here, or are you okay with that answer? Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Valentine. I didn't want to miss anything there. So thank you, Jonas. That was great. Okay, Les, I hope that's helped you out a little bit. That's a lot cleverer answer than mine. So thank you, Jonas, for that. So moving on, actually, it's funny, in that time, Richard, what a wonderful question. I have to do the end bit of his question first, because I like that. Where there's muck, there's brass. Isn't that a great one? Now, what's Richard on about? Well, why so few ideas of how to harvest these materials for reuse within Earth orbit? Well, Richard, thank you. Brilliant. Yes, we're in got our recycling heads on. Absolutely. My only initial thought is a lot of, certainly the low Earth orbit satellites, if they're going to be removed, being smaller, there's a very good chance they're simply going to be grabbed, caught in some way, and they'll be just dragged effectively back into Earth's orbit. And of course, that process, they don't survive. So sadly, if a lot of material goes that way, then of course it comes down, that's it, it's gone. And I'm not sure recovery is possible, although there are some thoughts that if the debris was located, they could recover material from what's left. You know, some materials will survive that. So that's one thought. The other is, of course, you know, whether we bring it down or we don't bring it down, you know, leave it up there and work with it. And from a satellite point of view, there are people dealing with, you know, servicing in space, etc. So there is quite a lot of detail there, and we could do with Harriet at the moment, but we'll come to that in a moment. But I see Roger's waving his hands around there now, and Roger, you got something to add, please, to this, you know, this recycling moment?
Well, yes, I do. We're talking about recovery, and you're talking about reutilization of spacecraft. I'm going to go right back, and you also mentioned there are now plans for reboosting spacecraft in orbit. I'm going to go right back to the start of all this in 1963, and the illustration that Harriet made in 1957 when Sputnik was up showed how little of the resource we were occupying. That's the space resource we were occupying. Then she moved on to 2018 and showed how much more we're using, and the percentage increase is remarkable. I'm going to go back now to 1963 when we started serious communication satellite operation, and we didn't have the capability to recover spacecraft at that time. So we had a design life of a spacecraft of 10 years. We had a maneuver life determined by the amount of fuel on board the spacecraft, which could be 13 years at least, and that's what we aimed for. But at the end of the maneuver life, we did something that was called, we used what was called a parking orbit. And basically, you waited till you had the last few kilograms, I think it was 2.5 kilograms of fuel on board. Given that there was no dipstick and there was no meter to say how full the tank was, we had to work it out on pressure. So you calculated when you had your 2.5 kilos of fuel left on board, the spacecraft had gone beyond its lifetime. It had paid its way. So we just turned the apogee motor, which is the main motor of the spacecraft, to Earth, and we then fired off. So the spacecraft went in a trajectory out into deep space, which was euphemistically called the parking orbit. So I guess there are some alien species who've picked up a lot of first-class hardware, but just wonder how they can use it and what they can do with it. But back to a more serious note. Now that we have the capability of putting booster packs up onto spacecraft, we can extend the life of them and therefore extend the usable life. They're a valuable resource. So putting them into the parking orbit was the original plan, and that was a plan when we just had satellites in geostationary orbit. We'd moved to geostationary. The first test satellite for telecommunications was Telstar, and that was a low Earth orbit spacecraft. But we then adopted the Clark principle of geostationary operation at 22,300 miles.
Roger, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Just a little note for those. It's funny you mentioned Telstar. I quickly looked at stuff in space. You'll be pleased to know it's still up there, wandering about. 1962, folks, and there we have a piece of debris. It's still flying. It's some 5,000 odd kilometers up there above us. So there we have first piece of debris, not recovered, nothing done with it. So sorry, Roger, to interrupt. I just thought that would interest.
That is fascinating, and so much is up there. I think the original SYNCOM spacecraft, that was the first one to demonstrate the geosynchronous or geostationary capability, is now sitting over Brazil, cold and lonely. It's a very lonely space out there. Well, it's very lonely out in space. It's very cold. So poor old SYNCOM is out there sitting on its own, and has been there since 1963, if not before. But getting back to the value of resource, the fact that Telstar is still there, the investment dollars that went into that have to be recovered. It should be recovered in some way, and how can we do that? Low Earth orbit spacecraft can potentially be recovered, and we have done that from Intelsat. We have taken the use of the shuttle. We've gone up and put spacecraft into the payload bay of the shuttle. It was done notoriously in 1992. with the recovery of the Intelsat 603 spacecraft, which was stranded in a low Earth orbit and couldn't get out of that orbit to get up to geostationary. The reason for that is a long story. I won't go into it now because it's a chapter in my book. I'll leave you to read the story. But that with the shuttle and being able to get up to 200 miles altitude, we brought the satellite to a parking space in the orbit, in the circular orbit at 200 miles. And then the shuttle was expertly flown by Dan Brandenstein to come up beneath our Intelsat 603 satellite. And then the task was to astronauts Thebe and Hewitt to go out and grab the spacecraft. They did eventually grab it, and it was a 4-ton spacecraft, 2.5 tons of which were sloppy fuel. So we now have well, there were 3 spacecraft in the on the back of the payload bay, and why there were 3 is once again a long story, but we'll not go there. Those three spacecraft grabbed the satellite, making many firsts in space, and then they had to then bring it down, put a new apogee motor on it, and let it be reboosted back into space. And the satellite went on to serve beyond its originally planned maneuver life, and was a valuable spacecraft in orbit. So that's one way we can do it if we have the capacity to recapture spacecraft and reboost them. That's what we were able to do with the shuttle, but it was a complicated and expensive maneuver. We never conceived never perceived, I beg your pardon, in those early days that we would be able to take a booster pack up and put that on the back of the spacecraft and effectively refuel it in space, which is what Grumman is now able to do with their space recovery or space boost mission. So that's a change, and that's where we're seeing evolution. And I'm sure Harriet can comment on the development of such vehicles, and also vehicles that can go up to recapture spacecraft and bring them down. Firing spacecraft into the parking orbit is a great plan for geostationary because it's the top of the pile. But if you want to fire a spacecraft into deep space from a low Earth orbit position, you require a lot of power, a lot of energy to get up through the higher orbital space and get out into deep space, which is going to be impractical for the smaller spacecraft. And also you have the risk that you've got to pass through the plethora of spacecraft that are now orbiting the skies. So it could be like a bagatelle, you could go off one to another and make your way up. So there are risks in doing that. The alternative of that, of course, is bringing those lower spacecraft down through the atmosphere. And for the smaller spacecraft, there's a reasonable probability that they will actually burn up through friction as they come through the atmosphere at their 17,500 miles an hour. Where they don't burn up, there'll be small pieces of debris, and this is once again your meteorites coming down that can be an impact on Earth. Hopefully they'll fall in the oceans, because we have 3 oceans around us, which is the majority of space, or majority of area covering the globe is water. So we've got that water, which is the greatest probability of there being a safe landing. So that's where we are on the recovery. There are 2 things there, and it's really in Harriet's field to answer the question in some detail, and we would welcome her comment on that, I'm sure. But otherwise, what we used to do was on the basis of clearing space and making good use of space. But since we've moved on to be a privatized, commercially orientated arena, we probably won't be firing things off into deep space. We'll try and reboost them as long as we can, make best use, sweat the asset as long as we can in orbit, and then hopefully be able to recover as much as possible before we reach the disastrous situation, potentially disastrous situation of a Kessler environment, where we'd have sufficient pieces of debris in space that would that would prohibit launching anything more. But that's where we are with getting the brass out of the muck, effectively.
Okay. Oh, right. Well, thank you, Roger. Richard, it's not a perfect answer, but as Roger alluded to there, and as I said at the beginning, I will pass this on to Astroscale on all of our behalves. And by the way, it's a good point to add some thoughts for the future. There's a very good chance that EMSTA will be providing us the time to book another 4 short meetings or short chats with each of our speakers again, so that we can cover a little more in depth of what each is doing, and maybe get into, for Mariba, some of the policies and the regulation for those who are interested. So we will have those chats, and we'll all being well, we'll get some dates out soon. But we want to cover that in the near term, so it follows this. And so I'm sure, Harriet, these sort of questions will keep them on board. We will write to Astroscale anyway, and hopefully we'll have an entertaining time with Harriet and actually figure out what really is going to happen in the now moment, rather than what Roger and I are used to in the past when we were young. You know, honestly, we were young in those days. Yes, there was a time. And just to cheer Roger up, you're quite right that yes, as I speak now, I do look at that website, Stuff in Space. It's amazing. All I did was put everything launched 1963 in the search engine, and guess what's in there? Syncom, right, #1 is right there, and you'll be pleased to know it's whizzing around nicely, and it's just a mere 29,000 and a bit kilometers above us, still on its way. So there's another bit of debris we left up there. So it's all very interesting, but you can tell now that we've been doing this a while, and I guess on the subject of the future as well, got to mention this because I don't think it's been mentioned. I hope, having messed up our dear planet with plastic and debris, when we go to Moon and Mars, could we be a little tidier perhaps there and make sure we don't leave behind, do what we do on Everest now and actually pick everything up that we drop and actually clean it up on the way out so that it stays clean. Otherwise, the moon's a lot smaller. We won't be able to see the moon soon if we keep filling it up with rubbish. So there's a thought. Anyway,
that was almost poetry, Martin. See the moon soon. I'd like to endorse what you just said about EMSTA. EMSTA would be delighted to get together with the speakers individually or in smaller groups and promote a small half an hour to an hour discussion group, just to amplify the situation, because this is a hot topic. It's interesting that the UK Space Agency has now grasped it as a hot topic, and I think this seminar is one of the first to address the problem seriously. And we've had some great experts on the table, plus the old heads of yours and mine, Martin, who were just here from the dint of experience we bring to the table, having been involved in this since its very, very early days. So yeah, thank you for that, and thanks for making that reference to EMSTA. And on EMSTA's behalf, as chairman of EMSTA, I fully endorse that we will be pursuing shorter sessions and looking forward to working with our speakers again as we progress more answers to the questions that have been raised.
No, thank you, Roger. And just a quickie, I'm going to share the screen to just make this a bit. I'm going to do this to be much more like Mariba's presentation, but just to show you, there you are. That is what Roger was talking about, Syncom. There it is. That's where it's flying right now with respect to our planet. So again, it's amazing what we can pick up and do and show. And you can see this for yourselves. As I say, just look up stuff in all one word .space, and you can play around to your heart's content. So there we go. I'll come back. So thanks, you, Roger, again. I think we've done it to death, and we better get on because there's a lot of more questions coming in. Thanks again. Well, data sharing. There's a subject. Jonas, I guess you've probably got an opinion on that. So can we hear it, please?
Yeah, I can add some thoughts on the data sharing. So due to the nature of our business, we talk a lot with satellite operators. We also talk a lot about data sharing. And from what we see is, first of all, not everybody is purely against it. So there are also many companies who are very open on sharing the data. And when you look at it, it makes sense because for most applications, there's free data already available anyways, the TLA data. It's just not precise enough for collision avoidance, and it's not precise enough for future planning. And there are actually already some commercial entities out there who share the data, their own data, such as Planet, and I think also Spire does this. I'm not 100% sure here. So I think there's not only this issue, but there's also the issue of the question where to share the data, because everybody says share the data, and then they share it into a closed system, for example, into the space in the Space Data Association. There you can share your data, but it's a closed system. You can share it with the US Stratcom, but that's also going into a closed system, which again might help others, but only with a big feedback loop. And I think what's important is that we get to the point that we set up a common and a commonly agreed upon way how to share the data and where to share the data, and make the access to the shared data very easy and also, well, reasonable for our space sector. So you don't have to enter a closed system, but it's an open system. And yeah. I think this goes very far in the direction what Moriba Jah is doing in Austin with Astragraph.
Do you feel that it's an uphill struggle, that actually, I believe ESA and people like DLR in Europe are much more into sharing and wanting to share good data to get this better, whereas in the US, being a much more, shall we say, commercial environment, that the US is the hard one to crack, because the SDA, much as we think of it as an international organization, of course, guess what? It's run by what is AGI and whatever they call their ComSpoc, is it now, or something? Anyway, whatever it's called, it doesn't matter, audience. That's neither here nor there what they call themselves, but it's very commercial. It's more commercial than I think everybody really thought it should be. And so you do have this difference between the US and I think Europe, at least, where Europe's trying to get it more shared, I believe. That's what I hear from ESA. Although I sometimes wonder what they say and what they actually do might be two different things. But I do know Moriba, that's one of the areas he's trying to, crack. And if he can crack it in the States, I think the rest of the planet will follow. In other words, if we get better access to the SDAs of this world, JSPOCs and any other SPOCs that you've got, not the sort that we get in the sky from USS Enterprise. No, this is the SPOCs. So I think Moriba's got an uphill struggle, mind. I mean, it's a common issue. This keeps cropping up. So, any extra thoughts against that, or is that?
I find it hard to say that US is in general more closed and Europe is in general more open. I think it's very much the single actor driven. So when you look at it, for example, for publicly funded missions in Europe, it's very diverse how you can access data and how precise the data that's available. So for scientific missions, usually there's a lot of very precise data available, but it's very hidden and it's very difficult to process it in the way that you would like to use it, but it's going in a good direction. And when you look into the US, I think it has both extremes. So from the overall data sharing, I mean, all data or almost all data that we're using currently comes from the US military. So they do a lot of data sharing, and they're very surprisingly, even I would say, generous with how they distribute the data. But they also have the other side of some operators who are most secret about what they're doing. So I wouldn't dare to say that it's a regional or a country or state or whatever issue, that it's not there yet, that it has a common place and a common way how to achieve this. And deciding on this will be very hard because everybody always wants to keep the data for them to then, of course, use the value of the data. And yeah, but
yeah, I totally agree, and thanks for that balanced view there. So very diplomatic of you, sir. Enjoyed that. But you are right. I have to say that if you think about JSPOC itself in the US, it's doing a lot of good work, actually. It's probably the only place that, I mean, you've got to give the Americans their due. They spend a lot of money on this for our benefit, all our benefit, actually. They've always spent a lot of money on this, and probably, if anything, Europe may lag behind in some ways to the US on that matter. I think ESA is probably playing catch up, actually, is perhaps nearer the truth, but we won't go into that, who's playing catch up and who doesn't do what. It's a problem in the sense that if we knew more and had more to look at, we wouldn't end up with the 4 places for one satellite, the 4 assumed positions of one satellite. We probably know exactly where the satellite was by now, so that has to be solved. I mean, while we're on it, and Jonas, and whatever you need to do from now on, do. But Valentin, I know this is something you did talk about earlier. So what's your opinion here on this one?
Yeah, it's an interesting stuff as, let's say, data sharing. Data sharing is between something. It's data is between the origin and the user. So someone have to pay for the data, and someone have there are users, producers and users. And the data sharing itself, as long as we agree that the data generation is public funded, the data should be shared. As long as it is not public funded, then data license owner is clearly defined. The problem is the following from the data sharing point of view, is that the satellite operators are not ready to pay for any data generation. So they want that this obligation is paid by the taxpayer, and meaning they just want to secure their business case on so-called taxpayers' money. And I do see this as a very problematic one, as I see the big ones, the mega constellation guys, as an lighthouse example, that say, okay, guys, we send up here our satellites, and then you measure, and we get the data for free, and everybody pays, and I get the revenues. That's not the way as it should be. So the data sharing itself, I would say that the data sharing is in the responsibility of the space object owner. So, meaning, if I am now produce an object up in outer space, I also have to take care that I measure it. It have to precise measurement, and I have to give the data for everyone else for free. Meaning the data sharing in a way is I do see that as a responsibility of the space object owners, and that until the end of the lifetime. Meaning, if I bring up a satellite, I also have a responsibility to measure not only the object, the position, but also the emissions. Meaning, it's not data sharing is not only on the space debris side, but also on the RF side. So if I bring up something, I have to take care that I make the data available, that everybody else can act according to the long-term sustainability rule. Okay. And of course, on the other side, I have a responsibility to get all the data that I'm with my object can apply to the long-term sustainability rules. So I think that is the point. It's not that we have a centralized system where I can get data and get it for free and do whatever I want with that. I do see that as an space operator, space owner, space object owner, or whatsoever responsibility.
Thank you. That's a food for thought. I tell you where we're going here, aren't we? We're starting to go away from the practical. Almost we're getting to the legislation or the regulation and the policies around how we launch and what we do when someone requires a constellation or a satellite put into an orbital slot. That point should then trigger the ITU to say, okay, you can do this, but you need to make sure your data is available, let's say through something like an association, but it could be by the ITU that starts this off. Because I'm not saying share it. I'm not saying share it everywhere at once. It can't be to everyone, you know, everybody. It's talking about responsible places that have a track record, a university, a company, another monitoring center, someone that has proper responsibility about trying to do this properly, that where the data could be put in.
Yeah, yes and no. This is an organizational issue where not one, it could be multiple. It can be a service that, okay, it can be even a commercial service to say, okay, I pick up your data and I take your responsibility. I take over your responsibility. I pick it up and I publish it. Good, and that it doesn't cost you, and it might cost you a few dollars per time when I pick it up. But it's like a tax advisor that, okay, you give me your data, I make the balance sheet. Yeah. So I do not see here a centralized system, but my idea, yeah, is now in that way a little creative thinking, as this would mean that all space data is available, and there are a lot of interests that this is not available. Good. You see, there are intelligence, there are military, there are politicals, and there are lobbyists, and of course the operator itself. If someone else knows where is my spacecraft and my spacecraft damage something, it might be a responsibility claim, a liability coming from that. Okay. So, and that's what data sharing and the responsibility and bringing it to an picture means, okay, if I do not do this, I'm a bad guy and I'm excluded from public money. This would help that the spacecraft owners, responsible persons, will act according to a long-term sustainability regime. Yeah, that say, okay, guys, we don't know, we are not there, we are flying blind. What means, okay, if I have to be safe, I have to know where all other objects are, and this helps me to be on a safe track.
Well, gentlemen, I'm thinking that we probably raised more questions than we started in the original, just mentioning the word data sharing. I have a nasty feeling that we've now raised. We could go on with this probably and create, I don't know about a seminar, we could have a week's workshop on this and probably end up getting not much further. We know our colleague Mariba is into this sort of world of trying to figure out, is it policy, is it regulation, is it, you know, how do we get to some sort of model that we can then make this sharing happen, isn't it? It is complicated. There's money, but I mean, I have to say that if you're going to spend all this money on a satellite, surely it's not too much to ask to add $1 million to that spend to actually help out on the data sharing. When you think about how much it costs to put, especially a geo satellite, let's say, but a large constellation, you know, 40,000 satellites, surely there's some money available to put back into the system to help.
I jump in that. No, I have to say you are not right. If I'm now SpaceX, and I have to take into consideration that I daily measure and my positions of all the satellites, not only with an internal GNSS receiver, but also with external ones, and I have to pay the guys who are measuring. This is business case relevant, and it is also business case relevant if I crash one of my, if I produce debris and I crash one of my satellites, I have to measure all the pieces, yeah, because I'm owning the pieces, and this would extremely go now into real money, where you are, let's say, the long-term sustainability rules are business case relevant.
So really, nobody thought about this, yet they're allowing large constellations to go up without actually thinking through the whole problem and the whole role of doing this. I love it. I love all this technology. I love the fact we're doing LEO. I think it's really exciting. I see it. I see benefit. I see some of the business case. I don't see it all, but that's just a personal opinion. But you know what? We are definitely leading to a place where it wasn't thought about by the industry, shall we call it, at the beginning. In other words, it carefully got put to one side.
It has an analogy to the atomic power industry, good, because they are producing this atomic waste, and they are not responsible, and they are not taking responsibility to take care the next 10,000 years. And that is a public, and they moved it to a public taxpayer problem, but they earn the revenue.
So if we keep the story going, we got to. It's politicians that you got to get to eventually, and they need to listen. Trouble is, do they understand? But that's another question. Don't even go. So thank you very much, and you know.
Yes, I do have something to add to the data sharing conversation, Martin. It really picks up on what Mariba was saying about regulation. When we started all this, 1963, as I've alluded before, we had multi-government, not-for-profit cooperatives where all the governments had their say and could agree to share data, and it was part of the constitution of those organizations that they would share data. In the late 90s, we saw a move to privatization, and that move to privatization has moved us into a commercially competitive environment. And in such an environment, the sharing of data is a hard-won task. I go back again to 1963. The ITU allocates the frequencies, and when Mariba was talking about a highway and regulation of that highway, and that there's no allocation of regulation space or regulated space in the highway for each constellation. I would just want to make a point that and on the basis of Douglas Adams' statement, space is big, we would look at coordination of one spacecraft against another spacecraft. So it's a one-to-one basis of coordinating those spacecraft in orbit. Do they interfere with one another? No, they don't. Okay, we had 3-degree spacing. We had a good idea of what those spacecraft could generate in terms of power. But today, power has increased enormously from what we had before. The risk of interference is greater than what we had before, but we still have no change in the one-to-one coordination of spacecraft for approvals of orbit. As far as orbit is concerned, geostationary spacecraft are allocated an orbital slot above the equator. And it's we have, as I said, 3-degree spacing initially. It's reduced to 2-degree spacing, and sometimes we have spacecraft stacked up in one location. For example, the Astra series of spacecraft are stacked one above the other in space, not sitting on one another's shoulders, but they're decently spaced in altitude, but they are at the same location. So we've got that situation that's arisen. But in terms of allocating space for geostationary spacecraft and coordination of that, it's been a task that's I suspect has been put in the too difficult pile. The analysis of interference is one thing, spacecraft to spacecraft, but the analysis of constellation to constellation, there is no software to do that. But what we're looking at is the point Mariba was making about regulation. The WRC, the World Radio Conference, meets every 4 years, and we've just had the 2019 conference report published, in which there were statements that questions raised will be deferred until the next conference in 2023. Now, in the next 4 years, between those two decision points in the World Radio Conference cycle, we're going to have something in the region of 50,000 spacecraft launch. Well, that's what's been planned anyway. So with those launches coming up, there's going to be no regulation, because part of the discussion for WRC 2019 was to look at the coordination of constellation to constellation. There is no software yet developed to do that, although WRC 19 did look at the specification for software. So there was a functional requirement for software and a functional design published, which is now at iteration number 3, which some people say is close enough to do the job, but there's still no actual software developed to do the analysis. Now, it's really an academic study that needs to be done, and I think from the models we've seen that that are available in Stuff It in Space or Stuff in Space website, for one, it shows that the objects are being tracked. What Harriet showed us, the objects are being tracked, and from what the other 3 presenters showed us, yes, the data is being tracked. Mariba's point was that it's being tracked, and it's a question of how you apply the algorithm to where they are, because the raw data is there. But that raw data now has to be analysed, maybe with cloud computing, to get the probabilities ironed out. But it's something that needs to be done to enable us to analyse the interference risk between the constellations. And if we know what the interference risk is, we know what the risk of a collision is going to be. But it's, there is no software to look at constellation to constellation at the moment. Going back to 1963, we did satellite to satellite on a one-to-one basis. That analysis was done, and as far as we go today, that's still the basis of all interference and coordination of satellites. So coordinating these massive constellations that are coming up with, for example, Skylink, they have a huge distance to travel to get the analysis correct before those satellites can be approved by the ITU. And that's the point that follows Mariba's point about the highway. You need to be licensed to get to drive a car on a motorway. Everyone needs to be licensed. These satellite operators need to be licensed to get their satellites in orbit. And that license has to show a certain degree of technical competence. it has to show a certain degree of deorbitability. They have to demonstrate that they can deorbit safely from their plan. And as you made the point you made, Martin, earlier in the discussion, the lifetime of these smaller spacecraft in these larger constellations is maybe 5, possibly 10 years. So there's a very much shorter time span to look at. The reuse of spacecraft is going to be a critical problem to address, and getting the data shared is the critical part of this, so that ITU can coordinate one constellation against another constellation. Then the data has to be shared. But as I said before, we've moved from multi-government organization, not for profit, with governments involved and having control of all and having agreement on all matters that are pertinent to spacecraft. We've now moved to a privatized commercial environment where the data may be confidentially secure, and there may be a great fear of breaking commercial confidence. So we have to overcome that barrier now as well in getting data shared. But it is imperative that the data is shared for the reasons of coordination, for the reasons of interference, which is your main bugbear, Martin. You've done such a brilliant job in controlling interference. Now, I'm not going to go back to 1960, whatever it was, when we conducted the first ever exercise on interference, and there was some maverick operator who conducted the exercise. I can't name names now, but you have done stentorian work in making sure that we are in a least interference environment for our satellites in operation, and it's something that the data necessary has to be shared as a fundamental principle of safety in orbit and making the orbit and the environment of space as safe as it possibly can be.
Thank you, Roger. And I will add something there. It's a good reminder, good old 1978. Who remembers that? Wasn't me. Wasn't me.
Really?
But on that note, it's funny, just one thing I hadn't thought about before, but you did remind me about data. The funny thing is, on the interference group, that's SIG, we deal with radio frequency interference, which is a whole subject. One day we'll do one of those too. Don't worry about it for now. But the thing that tells us what we should do next is the raw data about the types of interference we see, the regularity, the how many times, what it is, the flavors of different radio frequency problems, whether it's from the jammer that everybody loves in the press to the obscure. But the point is, it's the data, those statistics, that tell us what we should be concentrating on. And it's even more critical here for debris, isn't it? I mean, it's just totally critical to know what we got to do. And, you know, we saw the example from Mariba. We've got a satellite, we know where it is. Well, guess what? One of 4 places at the moment. Maybe there's 10 places. I don't know. That's not good.
We know where it might be.
Roughly, give or take a kilometre. But looking at the stats from Valentin earlier, of course, he's getting 644 close moments at 1 kilometre. So being a kilometre either way is not really a good idea at this point in time. So enough for there, I think, Roger. Thank you for that. And yeah, sorry.
Just on that point, a kilometre. I mentioned earlier the reboost of Intelsat 603. Anecdotally, I'll throw this in. You may wish to throw it out. But I was privileged to be the UK witness to the recovery of 603 when the shuttle went up and Dan Brandenstein did his flying in formation with a 17,500 mile-an-hour satellite. When I was witnessing that at Intelsat, I was invited to join the Chief Operating Officer, John Hampton of Intelsat, and we were standing marveling at the technology and marveling at the bravery of the astronauts in space, grabbing our 4-ton spacecraft. And a news hound came across to Mr. Hampton. He said, John Hampton was an Australian guy, and the news hound came across and said, "Hey, Hampton, why can't you guys just fly your satellite down into the payload bay of the shuttle and be done with it?" And John's response was quite cool. He said, "Well, that's a good idea, mate, but our accuracy with the satellite is plus or minus a kilometre, and I don't think NASA would be very impressed." So it's a question of accuracy. It's a question of tolerance, and I think Mr. Hampton showed remarkable tolerance when he fielded that question so admirably. But I'll just leave that with you.
Well, while you're leaving me with things, there's one thing I don't think I did say it when we were waiting to start the main event, but that we weren't recording or it was just light-hearted chat. But I will repeat for those. You did mention the word highway and licensing and all sorts of things. Just like to remind people, one way of looking at this is a good friend and colleague of mine put not too many days ago. Said it's like opening a china shop in the middle of a motorway. So there we have debris someday. Not quite the bull in the china shop, but there you go. It's a nice analogy. I thought it would add some fun to that moment. So thank you, Roger. That was both a little bit of reminiscing. Sorry, folks. We are old people. We're allowed to do this. Yeah, thank you, Roger, and quite right. We've got another interesting question here, which is one for the experts, and for Alan Goodfellow, thank you. I'll read it out. I understand that modern satellites can be extremely small. Correct, Alan? CubeSats, nanosats, small sats, they're all in there, all terms. They're small. By comparison to what Roger was mentioning, 4 tons and up. How does the LEO debris grabber distinguish between a piece of junk and a small working device? A good point. And if we think about Mariba's answer about, I would have said, well, we know where it is in space. But if we look at Mariba's assumptions that perhaps we're not so sure where things are, and therefore a piece of debris could be lying close to something we don't want to pick up. I personally don't know the answer to that. I was going to ask Jonas or Valentin if they know the answer to that. Do you guys?
Yeah, I would say the way how it's currently is basically, even though the position is uncertain, it's certain enough that you wouldn't confuse spacecraft usually. And it's sometimes you have this short after launch that when you launch, I don't know, 30 CubeSats at once, that you cannot distinguish them in the orbital data. And they're always, you see this by them switching names all the time. But after sufficient time, you know quite certain which object is which one when you want to grab them. And you furthermore, usually the concepts for debris removal, they have some image recognition, etc. on board. So if they were to grab a certain satellite that looks a certain way, they would notice if it's a different one.
Good. Well, Alan, there's a partial answer, but I think, and Jonas can probably
I could add something.
Oh, Valentin, yeah, go ahead, yeah. Valentin.
Now, it depends on the context. My own satellite, I can quite surely, let's say, if I have a modern satellite, I might have a GNSS receiver there, so I also know where is my own satellite. Okay, that is, I know where is my satellite. But on the context of a differentiation of a small satellite, modern CubeSat or whatsoever that is, if it does not have a propulsion system on it, it is, for me, from my point of view, the same classification as debris. As it doesn't matter if it works or not, it is not possible to maneuver it. So from the point of view to say security or risks, any CubeSat is one big piece of debris, as I would say. And this, now from the context, in the data itself, it's called payload, good, or operational satellite. But what does it help me if it's an operational satellite if it cannot move? It's just flying and nobody can do something with it. That's my point of view to say, in which context we are looking into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentin. That's brilliant. Just to catch up with some the answers, Richard replied, and thank you, Richard. He doesn't really want to bring it down. The material has already been launched at huge expense. So I do see a point, and that leads to Thomas's thoughts that should there be an international space debris harvesting agency financed by a levy? Oh dear, as soon as you mention financed by a levy, that's where everything starts to go a little wrong. And I've got some more questions further up that came in just before that, but I thought that would just complete some views from the audience about, you know, the recycling angle of that. And we've had two questions on the large part. So one from Peter was, what is the largest, heaviest piece of junk that is out there, disused, and the largest and heaviest we can actually remove? Jonas, do you have that, just a fact on that?
It's hard to, well, I don't know actually at the moment which is the heaviest one, but I have a list here at hand, which is from calculations that we made some time ago, which are the most critical ones. And here's maybe some background information. We defined as the most critical objects in orbit those that have first a high probability that they might collide over the next 100 years with an object that leads to the destruction. Then their mass, because the heavier an object is, the more impact it would have on all other objects if it collides. And then the remaining lifetime it has on orbit. This plays in hand, basically the longer the object itself would be on orbit, the longer fragments would be on orbit. And from this consideration, the most critical ones are usually old Soviet Union Zenit 2 secondary rocket stages. They are on top. They are followed by a famous European satellite called Envisat. And Envisat has about 8 tons in weight. And then we have some METOP satellites and then a long list of further rocket stages, some Ariane 4 stages and many, many more old Russian stages. And from the environmental risk, these would be the ones that makes most sense to remove from the environment.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas, and that agrees with exactly what Valentin said at the end of his presentation. So yeah, I think we all agree with that, especially as their particular orbits, if we like, are across the normal orbit areas, which is not what we want at all. And of course, it wasn't long ago that a large lump of old rocket, landed on a satellite and caused us another few thousand pieces of debris at that point. That was only was that a year or so back now? Not long. Anyway, so yeah, Peter, thank you for that question, and that sort of that gets to Derek's question: is it ethical and engineeringly possible to send the large bits of redundant rocketry off to melt into the sun? Well, yeah, I guess that. Which way do we do it? I mean, it's an interesting ethical question. Do we just chuck it somewhere else? I know there's a lot of ethical questions about, you know, are we just going to move ourselves to the moon and start cluttering up the moon? It'd be a good idea, wouldn't it, if we just got to grips with that before we actually spoil somewhere else? We need to get to grips with ourselves. In answer to that, have we got any takers there, Roger or Jonas or Valentin? If you unmute, Roger, you can go ahead.
I would just suggest that once you've put the satellite into an orbit, from a transfer orbit to its final orbital position, whether it be a polar orbit, whether it be an equatorial orbit or an ecliptical orbit, you then, to get it to the sun, you'd have to have quite a lot of energy to divert it from its existing orbit to a new orbital direction to get it toward the sun. So it then becomes a practical question. And I noticed Derek's question said, is it ethical and practicable? I think it's probably going to be impractical, because there's not going to be the energy on the spacecraft unless you take up a booster. And something, when we were planning spacecraft back in the 60s, 70s, we never conceived that there would be a booster package could be sent up. So it's you know, at face value, it's impractical, because the amount of energy required to change the orbit and get it out into a sun destined orbit. But then, if a booster package is available, would you want to spend the money to put a booster up there just to go and kill the thing? You know, once again, the ethical question comes to the fore. I don't know whether Valentin or Jonas can add to that, and I'm sure they can, and I'd welcome them to add to it. But I just threw that in. And maybe you'd wish, Martin, I'd thrown it out, but there we go. That's just.
Well, that's what we're trying to do, isn't it? Are we throwing the debris in or throwing it out? I tell you what I will do, though. I will be passing this particular type of question over to Harriet, over to Astroscale, because they're looking at that, you know, the sort of recovery and what to do with all this. So I will pass all these over, and we will get this written up. And for those that are interested, it's very likely that we will be putting, as I said at the beginning, for some, we will be putting together some, you know, 30-minute, 1-hour sessions, just talking about each of our speakers' immediate area of expertise. And so we will arrange that over through December and January to follow up on this, so that we get a chance to talk with them at sort of a one-to-one basis with you all. So we'll let you know about that as we get organised and do that. Yeah, I mean, if there's anybody wants to add to that, please do. But we do have some more questions. We've got some good ones here. Friend and colleague, Christian, thank you. I've got 2 questions from you, and I'd like to start with your second question, Christian. What will we have to do to make all operators aware they are actually in the same boat? Oh, well, there you go, Christian. Did I say that, or did you say that? I'm not sure. Common sense says, well, they ought to know that. When I look at the Space Data Association and what it's achieved is amazing, because to get that to happen took a long time and a huge amount of effort from the few to make it possible. And it's still going today. And right now they've reduced everything down to, you know, looking at conjunctions, i.e. trying to figure out how to miss each other up. That's their total and sole responsibility for the large operators. But they only have a snapshot of operators as membership, which I cannot believe to this day why satellite operators aren't forced into that type of association. In other words, the ITU should be saying something. If you want an orbit or an orbital slot to launch a satellite of any kind, you have to join the Space Data Association. In other words, you make it something they have to do, just to cut the cost to join the association compared to launching either small or large satellites is a drop in the ocean. No, that's not a very good term either. That's not very good either. No, that's what we're doing already. Sorry. So, Christian, yes, they ought to know, but it is tricky. We're back to that shared data problem. Nobody actually wants to share anything. Yet, the only way to really resolve this and is to work together and make it happen. So, I'm not sure it answers your question, Christian, or not.
May I add something to that?
Certainly, Valentin.
It is, for the moment, the space environment is, let's say, it's cost-free. You just have to pay for to launch it up, and it doesn't cost you anything. And all the business models are placed in the same way that say, okay, if it's up there, I don't have to have anything, no costs So the resource is for free. And meaning the resource is for free, I can do whatever I want. And as long as the government supports this approach, then of course everybody, commercial ones and science, whoever, they don't care if it's their polluted or not. So what have to be done is we have, let's say, to sit together and say, do I, as if I'm the government, and say, do I support this or do I not support this, in a way that say, do I give money to a company working in this way of doing pollution and don't care. So it should be a kind of easy way to say what should be done is to exclude companies acting in space from any public money, not sharing data and not behave to the right way. That should be done, meaning exclude them from public money, and they will follow the regime, because space activities without any public money is not existing. Even Elon Musk, the big one, earns a lot of money from states, from government, now with NASA, with the flight yesterday up there. Yeah, this is public money. So exclude them and they will join.
Interesting thought.
May I add to that, Martin, please? Valentin makes a very good point, that if the governments were able to charge a levy, but unfortunately, in the 90s, there was a move to take satellite constellations away from being government cooperatives that were not for profit, and the whole industry was privatized, and the privatization of the industry has led us to a more secretive, commercially competitive environment, and I think the governments, if they were to start to impose, then they're too late. They've lost the opportunity. Everything worked with full government cooperation and agreement when it was a multi-government cooperative environment, and that was the way all satellite constellations were managed. You had let's take the Intelsat structure. That's the grandfather of all systems. You had a meeting of signatories, which were the nation states. The signatories appointed their governors, who were usually the telcos of those signatories of those nation states, and those telcos managed the gateway facilities on behalf of their nation, and in some cases, and adjacent nations. And those governors made the decisions for Intelsat overall, and steered the Director General of Intelsat and instructed the Director General of Intelsat in which way to proceed. It was a good model. It was an excellent model because it was a government not-for-profit cooperative. And the not-for-profit bit's interesting because we found that there was a return on investment which ran to a peak of about 18–19% at a time when the banks could give you a maximum of maybe 12%. So it was an obvious catch for the governments to say, yes, I'll subscribe to this. I'll be part of this non-competitive, not-for-profit cooperative, and then the bean counters saw the revenues, and they became easy pickings because they're cash cows. They became easy pickings for privatization, and there was the exit of the government control, and it handed into private commercial control. So there's an opportunity lost there for the governments to have any levy. I don't disagree that there should be a levy. I believe there should be, and it's where It's where Mariba was talking about the highway. You don't get to drive on a motorway until you've passed your test. And if we're going to allow people to get up there and drive satellites around the skies, they should have some test that shows their competence to do so. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Roger. It's funny actually, because Christian again asked the earlier question. Would you see there is a kind of competition between classical satellite operators and mega constellation operators? Well, of course, for business models, probably yes. Be interesting to see, Christian. I'm not convinced, as I said in my piece during the session, that I didn't want to get into business models. That's almost a whole nother dreadful place to go at the moment in our industry because of exactly that. The mega constellation, this bringing broadband everywhere. Oh, I don't know. The amount of cost for ground infrastructure. It seems it's easier to put stuff up in space, but the ground infrastructure to do all this is tricky. So I'm going to say there is. I think there is a kind of competition, natural competition, but I think it's worse than that. I think we're going to have to watch this space. My personal opinion is says that not all the mega constellations are going to make it. It's as simple as that. Just too many are trying to vie for too little, I think is my summation of that one. But I am strictly worried about quantity of bits and pieces. And if those people go bust, an interesting thought, if those business models don't work, then what do we do with all that junk that's now just junk because it doesn't now earn any money? If they're broke, they can't afford to go and get it. There's a big problem. You see how the debris problem is not, we're not getting any further yet. It's growing, not shrinking, in my book. So Christian, it's probably not a great answer, and I don't know whether Valentine has a better one, or Jonas or Roger, but you're welcome to butt in at any time.
I can happily share some thoughts on the last two questions.
Yes, please.
So the first one was basically the reason why satellite operators not all follow common sense and clean up behind themselves or behave sustainably. One reason that's quite often forgotten is basically when you look at the risk for a single satellite that something happens, it's very low. And when you calculate the risk with the costs you have to comply with guidelines and rules, as long as you're not forced, it's more expensive for yourself to do something than to do nothing. This is the common effect of a problem that is coming but not there yet. And when you're operating in space at the moment, you're not part of the problem that's coming, but the future will have the problem. So this is one big issue that we see with some satellite operators, that when we contact them, they say, well, yeah, it's interesting, but when I do the numbers, the business case doesn't add up. It's more expensive for me to do all these maneuvers than just taking the risk of losing one or two satellites. And one other perspective on the government and the mega constellations. So when we look at the objects that are actually currently, at least in the environment, the really dangerous ones, they are all government satellites. So I wouldn't say that any government behaved much better than any commercial entity behaves at the moment. So always putting this government schemes ahead and saying that they followed a better approach. There are some entities who are further and some who are behind. And this is the same for governments as it is for commercial entities. And when we look at mega constellations, for example, it's true that they are a potential very high risk, but they actually also, in different ways, consider this from the beginning. SpaceX, for example, moved themselves to much lower orbits. So if their initial constellations fail, the satellites would disappear within a couple of years. So it's not that they would be up there for hundreds of years. And it's a bit different for OneWeb. They stick with their high orbit,
but they have been, at least in the beginning, quite open about their plans and took care and listened to advice how to behave more sustainably. So this is one of the reasons why they, for example, release their satellites in very low altitudes and then spiral them up, because usually the chance of a satellite failure is most of the time at the very beginning. And if you lose the satellite in the very beginning at 400-kilometer altitudes or below, it's gone within a couple of months or a year or so. If you lose it at 1,100 kilometers, of course, it would be there for almost forever. So I think it's many different aspects, and there are in all types of entities people who are behaving good and better, and people who are behaving worse. And I think it's not a good practice, so to say, to point at one certain type or one certain business model and say that you do this worse. And last, when you look at active debris removal, for example, I think the most viable customers for someone like Astrosky are actually the large constellations, because when you operate a large constellation, you have to be much more sensitive about the topic for your own purpose, because if the business model pays out, the biggest value you have are your orbits. And when you pollute your own orbits, you basically I hear something. You basically destroy your business model. So as far as I know, OneWeb, for example, partnered up with Astrosky to have them as a fail-safe in case something happens, some satellite gets lost in their orbits, that they can remove it from the environment. And also, if SpaceX is very silent about what they're doing, they're also planning for themselves to have satellites within the constellations that they can use to remove failed satellites. So it's very complex, and the big issue is that we don't have any rules to follow. So everybody's doing what they want. Nobody knows what they're doing, and some do good, some do bad, some are in the middle.
Well, thank you. Listen, we're getting close. We need to draw this to a close. But it was interesting. Shamoon asked a very short question, probably with an incredibly long answer, but we'll try and get to the point here. What is the useful life of a new satellite launched in orbit? Well, of course, Shamoon, it's all to do with how far up and what it is. A lot of the LEO ones, we're looking at possible 5-year life, whereas in the GEO arc, the geostationary arc, you're looking at, you know, in excess, certainly of 15, but more likely excess of 25 years. So out there is the best spot in the world for everything, but it doesn't solve everything being that far out from the planet. It's useful and it's a powerful geostationary slot to have, but so it all depends how small, how large. I mean, some of these CubeSats only last for missions for months, and then they literally come down, burn up, and that's it, they're gone. So it varies depending on usually the size of the satellite and its orbit. Does anybody have anything to add to that one quickly before we close? Oh, look, silence. All little red dots everywhere saying mute. So there's only me left. Well, on that note, it's we said we'd close at around 17:15 to just finish off with some few thoughts from Roger and I. First of all, I want to thank everybody that attended, and we had a good number all the way through. We've lost a few now, but I'm pleased to say we still have over 50 of us online at the moment, and thank you for staying the course. Sorry about the beginning. I don't apologise for the hiccup on something to do with the share screen just disappeared off the face of the earth, so that wasn't clever, but these things happen, typically, luckily only at the beginning. But again, thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it. For my part, just to close, for me as the chairman, I think we're still very much at the beginning of a big conversation, and we need to do, well, there's more to do, basically. We have a lot to discuss, and we need to engage with more people. And I would like to think that in the end, it'll take more people to work together, but I know how darn difficult that is. And so I go back to where our last session with Valentine is to fix or not to fix. Well, I'm not sure where we are. I think we understand it better, but people like Jonas's company, Okapi, have got a lot to do, and with people like Mariba to go figure out where the data's going, what it's going to tell us. What do you think? What would Valentine analyze? And he needs better data, more accurate data, and more data to do that. And in the end, there's another thing called STM, Space Traffic Management. I've heard about it. I've been part of that conversation for at least 5 years around the globe. I'm not quite sure where we are with it. It's talked about, but I'm beginning to think that, you know, people like ESA and NASA need to do more together. I'm sure they're doing an awful lot together, but I think there's more to be done, and we need to be a little bit, you know, join those dots up. There's a lot to do. But overall, I'm hoping for those that are online that have connections, those that are maybe from academia or schools, I'm hoping it was a good start for breaking the subject into that area. We have more to give from both EMSTA, SIG, and the Community Heritage Society. We're working with the STEM teams locally, at least, in our local schools, and I'd like to expand that. So I'm hoping after this leads the way to a better and a more a better way of engaging with students before they leave school to go to university, or as the one student did on a recent tour I was involved with here in Dorset, to Airbus, you know, actually signed up for the apprenticeship scheme at Airbus. So that's what I think we also have to achieve here, and that's really in EMSTA's remit. But I'll say no more and hand over to Roger to close this off and thank everyone that's been involved with this. So to all of you from the University of Hertfordshire, EMSTA, the team of guys there, it's been a tricky ride to do this. Not perfect, but pretty close, and I'm pleased enough, and we can only do these things better next time. So thank you everyone again. Thank you. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you all for staying with us for as long as you have. It's my privilege to sit in front of you now and give a vote of thanks to everybody involved. This is our tradition with EMSTA, and I'd like to start by thanking everybody that's helped contribute to this year's virtual seminar. The University of Hertfordshire and Professor Quentin McKellar, who's Vice Chancellor of the University. I'd like to say thank you for their support over the past 21 years, and looking forward to continuing that relationship. To our chairman, Martin Coleman, who has prepared all the pre-recorded videos and pulled together the panel of speakers from SIG's, that's the Satellite Innovation Group's comprehensive contact list, and also, therefore, to SIG for making the resources available. To our speakers for sharing their intellectual property. Dr. Marie Bajard, the University of Texas, highlighting how we got to where we are and the enormity of the task in identifying the problem. To Jonas Radke, CEO and founder of Okapi, who focused on tracking the orbital debris with a prime focus on sustainability. I think critical for the future. And then to Harriet Brettel, who's the head of business analysis at Astroscale. They call themselves the space sweepers, and I'm not quite sure, because space is a vacuum, are they actually vacuum cleaners? So I'm just not quite sure where we are with that, but I'm pretty certain that Harriet would correct me if I've got that wrong. But I think it fits very well. What she told us was hugely encouraging. So the fact that there's a lot of money being raised to fund the collection and removal of debris in space. So to answer Quentin McKellar's question at the very beginning, this seminar hasn't solved the problem, but it's gone a long way toward it. And thank you very much, Harriet, for making that valuable contribution. I'd like to thank Valentin for his contribution and looking at the data and looking at data sharing and looking at the analysis of the data and putting his broad intellect to the problem. And it's a huge contribution to our business today. Thank you so much. And I'd like to move on to our thanks to those that have helped us cross the COVID gap. And in particular, I'd like to thank Amanda Atfield, the Head of Design and Technology at Berkhamsted School, for so graciously handing the award to her student, Dominic Coles-Safirio, who is an outstanding student who has so many attributes. It's hard to list them, but I think we're very, very pleased as EMSTA to have given him the award for 2020. With that award, we wish him every success in his pursuit of a career in engineering, civil engineering perhaps. But last but not least, again, thanks to you all, our audience, for staying with us through this first of our, hopefully many, virtual presentations. Next year, we'll be dealing with sustainable fuel sources, and one of our guests online at the moment, Peter Blair-Fish, will be chairing the organisation of that meeting. So thank you, Peter, and EMSTA looks forward to seeing you all again soon. Again, thank you, Martin. Thanks for putting the facilities together. Thanks for doing it all from the shed. And to you all, thank you to our contributors. Thank you to everybody that's paid attention to our session today. And those that didn't get online, they'll hear this message when they do get online and see the recording, which is being made now. So thank you all very much indeed, and good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.